Good morning everybody, and thank you for joining me again. Now, as you can tell, we are in another cemetery. But unlike the last cemetery that we visited, which was very well looked after, very well kept, this one has been completely abandoned. As you can see, all the gravestones are covered in ivy, completely overgrown. But more to the point, this cemetery holds a very, very dark secret. As you can see, the cemetery is completely overgrown. And in a lot of cases, you can't even see the names of the people on the headstones who are actually buried here. Which is quite sad actually. Now, the land that the cemetery stands on was bought in 1857 by the Reverend John Livesey, who, as it turned out, wasn't the God-fearing man he wanted everyone to think that he was. And the first person to be buried in the cemetery when it opened was a 2-year-old girl called Anne Marie Marsden, and she was affectionately known as the guardian of the cemetery. Now, the cemetery had another guardian. His name was Isaac Howard, and he was known as the sexton of the cemetery. Now, the word sexton literally means someone who looks after the cemetery and digs the graves. Now, Isaac Howard also had a small house somewhere in the cemetery grounds, which unfortunately is long gone. But I'll explain why later. Now, after Isaac Howard had been living in his house for quite some time, one day he suddenly left. At the time, nobody knew why and nobody knew where he'd gone. But shortly afterwards, someone else moved into his house, a man called Robert Dixon, and he was a labourer in the cemetery. Now, when he moved into Isaac Howard's house, he was said that he could smell something rather odious. In fact, a smell that disturbed him greatly. Now, on exploring the various outbuildings that surrounded the house, he eventually came upon the stables, but he couldn't get inside the stable because it was securely locked with a big chain and a padlock. But he could see through the cracks in the stable door. And when he peered through the cracks, the sight that greeted him horrified him, because inside the stable, on the floor, he could see piles of coffins. Some were broken, some were opened, but more to the point, there were piles of bodies. A huge pile of bodies laid on top of each other. Men, women, children, stillborn babies, all in varying states of decay. Oh yes, my friends, Isaac Howard was indeed a body snatcher, and he was in league with the vicar. And so it transpired that Isaac Howard was indeed digging bodies up and selling them to the Sheffield Medical School for dissection. Now, the vicar was involved, but in all fairness, he was involved to a lesser degree. Now, it has to be said that they were not on their own in this practice, because just down the road, the Sheffield Workhouse were doing exactly the same thing. People who died in the workhouse were shipped off to the Sheffield Medical School for dissection, and after they'd finished with the bodies, they were putting them back into coffins, taking them back to the cemetery and reburying them. Now, both Isaac Howard and the vicar, John Livesey, were committed to York Assizes for trial. But the sentences were very lenient. The sexton, Isaac Howard, received 3 months and the vicar received 1 week. Now, you may think that they are very lenient sentences, but a lot of the judges then believed that supplying the medical profession with bodies for dissection would improve the quality of the surgery at the time, which is why they were given very lenient sentences. Although it has to be said, if it was found out that you were actually stealing from the bodies, maybe a ring or a watch or something, that was much more serious, and for that you could be hung or transported or receive a very lengthy prison sentence. But that's what happened to the two perpetrators of this most heinous crime. This is an engraving of Sheffield Medical School, situated on the right hand side in the background, and it was on the corner of Surrey Street and Norfolk Street in Sheffield. And this is a painting of Sir Arnold Knight, the gentleman that opened the medical school in 1829 in Sheffield. And the last image shows a group of medical students dissecting a body, and if you look carefully in the background you can see an army surgeon attending as well. This was the Sheffield Workhouse. It was built in 1878 and is now part of the much larger Northern General Hospital. I believe at the moment the buildings are just used for offices. The next photograph shows a ward inside the Northern General Hospital, and I believe the photograph was taken in the early 1900s, and I dare say that the conditions inside the workhouse were not quite as comfortable as they look there. Now, when the general public heard about this hideous crime, they were none too pleased. I can imagine. And there was actually rioting outside the cemetery gates. And of course a lot of the people who were rioting wanted to know whether or not any of their loved ones had been involved in this hideous crime. But the only way to find that out was to dig the bodies up, open the coffins and find out whether they were still in one piece or whether they'd been chopped up into little pieces. Now we don't know whether or not that actually happened, because apparently in this cemetery there are around 30,000 burials. So we still don't know how widespread the crime was and how many bodies were involved. But what we do know is that while the crowd was rioting outside the cemetery gates, they then proceeded to the vicar's house and they burnt that down. They then proceeded to the sexton's house, Isaac Howard, and they burnt his house down as well. And here is a photograph of the vicar himself, the Reverend John Livesey, who was born in 1803 and died in 1870. And he was actually only convicted of falsifying the burial records. Now then, boys and girls, before we leave the cemetery, I want to put to bed, if you'll forgive the pun, a popular myth that has grown up around this cemetery over many years. Now the myth surrounds the world famous Buffalo Bill and his Wild West show when they came to Sheffield in 1891. Now the myth says that one of Buffalo Bill's performers, a Sioux Indian called Paul Eaglestar, died while he was giving his performance and he was buried in this cemetery. Well, it's not true. So let me tell you exactly what did happen. Now, just before we continue, let's have a quick look at Buffalo Bill and Paul Eaglestar. And here is the gentleman in question, Buffalo Bill, whose real name was Colonel William Cody. He was born in 1846 and died in 1917 at the age of 71 years old. And the next photograph is of the Native American Paul Eaglestar, who unfortunately died while he was giving one of his performances in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Right, what exactly happened to Paul Eaglestar? Well, he was here in 1891 and he did perform with Buffalo Bill. And he did die, but he wasn't buried here. What happened was, while he was giving one of his performances, he fell from his horse and sustained a compound fracture to his ankle, and he was admitted to the Royal Infirmary in Sheffield, which is over there. Now unfortunately, while he was in hospital, he got lockjaw and they cut his leg off. I mean, why wouldn't you? Oh, what's it with him? He's broke his leg. I tell you what, we'll cut it off. Anyway, as a result of his injuries, he died. But before we go any further, just let me read you a little page out from the local newspaper at the time, which says, Paul Eaglestar was injured when his horse fell from under him on the 14th of August 1891, a compound dislocation of the ankle. He was taken to the infirmary, but after 8 days lockjaw set in and his leg was amputated on Saturday night the 22nd of August. Although considered to be a very successful operation, Paul Eaglestar died in agony in the early hours of Monday morning, 24th of August 1891. Well, call me picky, but it didn't sound very successful to me. He breaks his leg, they cut it off, he gets lockjaw, and then he dies in agony. Ah, well, there you go. Now, he was actually put on a train and taken to London, and he was buried in an unmarked grave in Brompton Cemetery, and he laid there until 1970, when the powers that be then decided to exhume his body, or what was left of it, take it back to America, and he was buried on an Indian reservation in Montana at a place called Rosebud Cemetery. A very fitting end for a very brave man. So that is what happened to Paul Eaglestar. He's not buried here.
This is the hospital where Paul Eaglestar was admitted after his accident, the Royal Infirmary. It was opened in 1792 and eventually closed down in 1980. And the next photograph shows a waiting room inside the hospital where most of the people seem to be suffering from eye injuries.
Hello my friends. Now, although we've left Ward's End Cemetery, I wanted to pay a final tribute to all the military personnel that are buried there for my own personal reasons. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find any of the individual graves. Hardly surprising really. But the thing that most of them have in common is that they were all stationed at Hillsborough Barracks, which is about a mile away from the cemetery. Now, I didn't want to take you around the barracks as it is today, because it's just a big shopping centre and a hotel, a little bit on the boring side. So what I've done, at the end of the video, I've put some nice photographs together of the barracks how it used to be in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, with some other photographs of the soldiers, the parade ground and one of the hospital wards inside the barracks. Okay, right. Thank you for joining me, my friends. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I did, even though it was absolutely freezing in that cemetery, but I did still enjoy it. So take care, and I'll catch you all the next time round. Bye bye.
This is the original entrance to Hillsborough Barracks, being guarded by a sentry, and the barracks itself was built in 1848. The following photograph shows the facade of Hillsborough Barracks, which is situated on Langsett Road in Sheffield. And the following photograph is a group of soldiers that are sat outside the guard room in Hillsborough Barracks. This photograph was taken in 1901 and shows the St George's Day Parade, which is taking place inside the barracks on the parade ground. And the last photograph is a hospital ward inside the barracks, which shows two soldiers receiving some sort of treatment from two very nice nurses.